Welcome to Fight the Power Building Community through Audio Activism. I am really excited because I'm meeting everybody for the first time, and I didn't realize at least three of us are in New York, which is crazy. I will be moderating this session. My name is Saadia Khan. A bit about me. I am an activist, storyteller, Pakistani American immigrant, Muslim woman of color. My podcast, Immigrantly, it's a weekly podcast that basically features deeply personal conversations around race, identity, multiculturalism, and the general messiness of being human. I am so excited to have all of you here. And before we dive into the discussion, which I'm really excited about, I would like everyone to introduce themselves and we will go in an alphabetical order. So we'll start with Amara. Amara, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Amara Cofer, and I am the creator, host, and executive producer of Black Girl Gone, a true crime podcast. I am living in Philadelphia. I am married, and I have 3 children.
Maeve, next, over to you.
Okay, I loved hearing that, Amara. You sounded kind of surprised when you said, and I have 3 children.
I'm literally like muting in between because they're home and they're making noise. So, just.
Oh, you're amazing.
Heads up, yeah.
So, my name is Maeve Higgins. I'm Irish. I live in New York, and I'm a writer and a comedian and a podcaster, which I think is the most relevant area here. And I co-host a climate justice podcast called Mothers of Invention. And I used to have a podcast, Saadia, that's why I'm a big fan of yours, about immigration. I love podcasting. I'm so psyched to be here with the 3 of you in this little Zoom room to talk about fighting the power.
My name is Thimali Kodikara. I am probably most known for series producing and now co-hosting Mothers of Invention with my pal Maeve. I'm also based in New York City, but from my accent, you probably tell I'm British. Wasn't my fault. My parents migrated there from Sri Lanka back in the 60s. Still recovering from all of that colonial good stuff, but trying to use that as a superpower to work on the impact media. So trying to find ways to get the social justice messaging out through fantastic storytelling. So that's kind of my sweet spot.
Thimali, I love your introduction. Don't we all have that colonial hangover, right? Having grown up in Pakistan, I can write a book about it. So the first question that I'm going to ask all of you is about podcasting. No surprises there. Now, we know that podcasting has basically exploded in popularity. There are over 2 million podcasts. Crazy. But why do you think podcasts are appealing to activists and community organizers? And we will start with Amara again.
Well, I think that it's becoming popular amongst that group because of the ability to reach an audience that is interested in. I think when people are going to the podcast, they're seeking this out. You're connecting with people who either already know about it or interested in learning about it. And in some ways you can kind of drown out the noise of social media platforms and kind of speak directly to people. And I think people are seeing that. And I think because of the growth of podcasting over the past, 2 years, there's a lot of opportunity for people who are activists to start and to build audiences and build movements from them.
Maeve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think to add to what Amara said, I think that making a podcast is not, it's not easy, but it's not, it's simple, like you can, if you just have access to a phone, you can make and distribute a podcast. If you have access to a phone and the internet, I should say. So it's quite democratic, I think. Just making it. Now, getting it out there and having people listen and getting connected is another thing. But I do think there's something very immediate and great and democratic about the actual medium, where people who don't have, who've traditionally been kept out of regular mainstream kind of, big newspapers or opinion writing or radio, television. This medium is more accessible. And I think because, the population that you mentioned, Saadia, which is like activists or people who can have all these stories that need to get out there and who want to make change and kind of push out their own message, I think they're attracted to podcasting because of its immediacy and because of its accessibility.
I totally agree with that. Yeah.
And
I was just sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Thimali.
I was just going to say that I'm really glad that Maeve used the term democratic. Like I use that term quite a lot as well. Again,
I thought of it actually, Thimali. I actually thought of it.
God, I cannot win with Maeve ever. Cannot win.
Just kidding.
No, I think I completely agree. It is, in terms of like accessibility, it's incredible. Like when we started making Mothers of Invention, there really were hardly any climate pods at the time, and now there are gazillions, and that's partially because Maeve and I are so good at climate storytelling, but and everybody's inspired by it. But it's really it really has helped an enormous amount because of that barrier with mainstream TV, film. Like they're so far behind on it. And you have a lot of those environments are all white spaces as well. So we're talking about climate justice, talking about racial justice and intersectional feminism. Like these are things that people don't want to put on the telly still. We talk to mostly a lot of grassroots and immigrant and indigenous activists. Like these are not people you're seeing on the telly. But also our friend Marianne East-Hegler says often that, even when climate does start to mainstream, pods will probably still be there because it's a place that we can get really messy in conversations and then it really explore ideas in a way that things sort of have to be a bit more finalized with film and television. So I think it is definitely accessibility, but it's also the fact that like the nature of the conversation is more democratic too.
I love what both of you have said, especially the democratic nature, but we'll talk about sustainability as well, because as you mentioned, the barriers to entry are low, but how do we sustain podcasts? Something that a lot of independent podcasters struggle with, me being one, and we will circle back to that. But I want to go back to Amara and ask about your particular podcast, Black Girl Gone.
Yes.
You tapped into a different genre, right? Which was crime podcast and specifically focusing on murders of Black and brown women, Indigenous women. Did you see it as a radical act? And how has the response been to it?
So I didn't. And I think the way I got into podcasting, it's been the opposite for me. I wasn't an activist. I didn't start this podcast thinking, I'm going to be able to make a difference and people are going to, listen to this show. I started it because I came from the kind of true crime fandom of it all. I've been a consumer of true crime. I like Dateline. I like every true crime documentary that comes on Netflix. I'm one of, those people. But what I always noticed, and it's like, and I think as a woman of color, as a Black woman in America, you kind of get used to just not seeing yourself. And so it's not always at the forefront of your mind, like, there's not enough Black women in these stories. Like, you're just not used to seeing yourself. But I did notice that there weren't these stories being told as much for these women. And so, when I got the idea to start a podcast, it's like, as a Black woman, it was like, I kind of almost felt like a responsibility. Like, if I'm going to do this, then why not tell these stories? Why not focus on these women? I didn't think it was radical, but I also didn't think people would really care that much. I did think that I was taking the chance of starting a show that, well, maybe the reason why there are no shows like this is because literally nobody wants to listen to it. And so, you're taking the risk. But what I noticed is from the moment I kind of started promoting the show, that the feedback was overwhelming. And I'm like, okay, so maybe there is an audience for this. And maybe people do want to know about it. And it's become less and less radical of an idea and less, because people are not, I don't want to say feeding into it, but people are listening to the show and they're responding in a positive way. And it's opened up a lot of conversations and a lot of, conversations about things that people might necessarily were having before in this space. So no, I didn't necessarily know it was a radical idea. I just didn't think that people would necessarily care, anything.
Amara, just to follow up, what kind of conversations do you think people weren't having and are having now because of what you've created, this space where people can have these conversations?
Yeah, and I mean, like, I'm not taking credit for like the entirety of the conversation, because the conversation around missing white women syndrome has been happening for a while. I think that, the conversation about the lack of attention that the news, cable news particularly, gives stories involving missing and murdered women of color, Black women versus white women, is a conversation that people have been having. I don't know how much they were having it within the true crime space. I think that true crime has become a very large genre and it's growing. And what is coming out of true crime is that the same thing that we wanted from the media, is that cases are getting attention, cases are getting solved, cases are being reopened because the podcast did it and they, spoke to a witness and the witness revealed something. I mean, there's things that are happening at that level. And when we leave out the stories of Black and brown women, then we don't give them that opportunity. And so, somebody has to tell these stories. Somebody has to make this space. So I think that people weren't realizing how important it is for these stories to be told in that same space as well, being kind of elevated alongside of it.
So you're seeing real impact, right? Which is so important. Now, when I think of podcasting as a podcaster, I think of this intimate space, right? Where we are sharing conversations, but every time I'm recording something, I feel like I'm talking to a guest who I assume in my mind is a friend. And then everybody else who's listening is probably learning something intimately, right? And they have their own journey, no judgment. Like, it's a judgment-free zone to learn something, right? You're learning it in your own time, whenever you want to learn. How do you guys think sharing message intimately is different, or how does that work versus to a crowd? And how has your work and your experiences been impacted by your identities?
Whoa.
And we'll start with...
These are hard questions. And I love them, and they're so complicated, and you're so right to ask them, because I do think podcasting is this intimate space. And like, picking up on what Amara said, sometimes you actually have to make that space. So it's weird when you're starting out, because you just mightn't see it, like you mightn't see, okay, here's like, a place to talk about, in Amara's case, like the murders of Black women, brown women that haven't been covered. And then, for me and Thimali, what might sound so different, which is like climate justice. Actually, these are subjects that like are difficult. They're sad. They're, people prefer to turn away. But the intimacy of a podcast, like, I think I listen to tons of podcasts myself, and like the way I listen to them is often on headphones when I'm out for a walk, or when I'm at home by myself and I'm like cleaning the kitchen, like very personal spaces. Right. And, you get to know these voices, and you get to feel like you kind of know them a little bit. And I do think that's, a unique thing about radio, and because obviously there was always radio. I know we're podcasters, but there's, I think radio used to serve the same function and still does. And so I think that I might leave the identity question for later, because I suppose my identity is tied in with the work as well, especially when I made a podcast about immigration, because I'm an immigrant myself. But the question was, okay, this is my experience of being an immigrant. Like, what was yours? Because when I moved to America, I immediately saw how different different immigrant experiences are as regards to race and class, and which passport you to be born with, if you were even born in the state. So that's kind of an answer, and I'd love to hear from Thimali about like, Thimali, like, what do you think when, the intimacy of a podcast, which is like, you and I are friends, we host a show with Mary Robinson, and what does it mean when we're speaking to someone who's like in Australia, who's a water protector over there, and then it goes shooting into the ears of like somebody who's living in Memphis here, who's facing a whole other challenges that are also maybe related to climate justice. But like, how do you make sense of it?
It's such a good question, and I agree with everything that you said. It is what is interesting for my specific role, I think, is that I am a impact creative producer. So I'm actually like strategically trying to think about how do we find ways to get butts off seats to go and take action, right, in terms of our audience. So that I have to look at all of the sort of the things that are in play there. And there's, you know, you and Mary as the host, and now me as a host as well, and what roles we can play to try and get these stories across. And that is the intimacy part, right? Is like we have the privilege of using storytelling and women's stories, so we can talk about care and compassion through our storytelling, which is not a tool usually used when you talk about climate at all. But also there's the fact that, you know, I'm trying to diversify our audience. I'm trying to find, our audience is mostly English speaking and therefore global North. So I'm trying to find ways to get a global North audience to actually feel something emotional for global South stories, which are happening right now. Climate stories happening in global South are happening right now. Ones in the global North are happening at some point in the immediate future, right? So the strategy I've also taken with the editorial is like, we have a global North and a global South guest in every episode. So that way you immediately find empathy with a global North character, right? Global North guest. But when they're talking about the same theme, that means that we can actually have a global South mother of invention. And there's already a mental connection, emotional connection that's happening there through the global North voice. So that is quite strategic. There's also the strategy around how Mary is just so brilliant at talking to global South guests. You know, she really gets the issue. She's worked in various parts of the world for many, many, many years. And Maeve is so brilliant in talking specifically to global North issues. Again, our audience started out being pretty white global North. So Maeve can actually identify with that audience and can find very smart ways of talking about Black and brown and, you know, intersectional issues in a way that I cannot as a host. So when you're asking me about my identity, so I have another third role now, and I can speak directly to Black and brown audiences. And so I would say also Maeve is my secret weapon in that she is a comedian, you know, and truthfully, like, it's a very, very challenging, scary subject for people. And Maeve really helps welcome audiences in who maybe know nothing about climate or know that they should. And so they're more climate curious, and Maeve makes it easier for them to like stay and hold space for them, asking the questions that they're probably thinking about, but not, are too sort of afraid to ask.
Well, I love that, Thimali, because I think that's what we all probably have in common, which is, you know, I mean, all of us podcast makers on here and people listening too, probably, is this curiosity and these questions. Like, Saadia, I know your podcast is about immigration, but you're not just talking about your own experience. You're constantly asking questions. And like Amara said, it came from a place of kind of curiosity. She was always taking in these stories and then started to say like, well, where am I in this? And where are you in this? So I think curiosity is a really great weapon, and all the traits that come with curiosity, right? Like if you think about kids, even kids are curious, then they're like funny, they ask kind of stupid questions, but that's fine because they're kids and they're curious. And those are, like, I love that you called it a secret weapon, Thimali, because I think you're right. Like having some levity and curiosity means we can talk about hot, scary subjects like the climate, like immigration, which shouldn't be in any way, you know, cause any division, but it does here in America. And even like something as sad as, you know, unexplained or like unsolved murders. Like you can, if you bring the right frame of mind to it, I think you can include lots of other people too.
I think for me, I'm sorry, you know, speaking about the balance, because it's just me telling these stories, and it's really important for me on my show for people to understand that these stories are about a very specific, you know, these very specific demographic of people. And so my kind of goal, or I guess, or even sometimes challenge, is telling stories that are the podcast is not inclusive of everyone. I'm not telling stories about missing white women. I'm not telling stories about missing and murdered white, but how does the podcast still include those people? You know what I mean? Because I still want them to listen.
Exactly. Totally.
Get them to pay attention, because this is part of the problem. Yeah, I know that there are Black women that are going to listen to my show and that are going to care, but I need white women to listen to my show and care. I need white men to listen to my show and care. And so, it's always of kind of walking that balance and not. I try not to get too political on my show, because that's not the goal of my stories. At the forefront of my story are the women, and then next are their families, and then next are trying to get the stories out there and get answers. I don't want to turn it into political debates about law enforcement and things like that, even though there are conversations around these stories that I want my listeners to have. I want you to listen to this story and then have that conversation with your friends or your family or the people in your community or law enforcement that you know. I don't necessarily want to be the kind of the person who's making that conversation, or giving my opinion about that type of thing. So it's definitely, my and when it comes to my identity, my identity is that I am a Black woman. The show obviously is called Black Girl Going. I don't ever want people to be confused about what the motivation of this show is, but I want you to know that everyone is welcome to listen to this show, tell the stories about these women in a way that it could be, if you didn't know that there was a Black woman, it could be any woman. That's how I want you to listen to the story. You know what I mean? Like, obviously you're going to know that it's a woman of color, a Black woman, but as you listen to it, can't you imagine this could have been your sister? It could have been your daughter. It could have been your cousin. That's the goal of the show, because humanizing the victims in my story, the women in my story, is the biggest part of getting people to care, getting law enforcement to care, getting the mainstream media to care. So.
Totally. There's like an small element. I was just going to say, like, again, for all of us, for all of our shows, it's like immigration, you think immigration looks like this, but it actually looks like all of these other things as well. Or you think that Black women, are functioning in this way, but it's actually all this other stuff as well. There's like being able to, through storytelling, through intimate storytelling, we actually get people to realize, like, Black women are not a monolith, immigrants are not. It's
there's so much that we've talked about, and there's so much to deconstruct here, whether it's creating something out of curiosity, out of need. For me, it was visceral reaction to what was being said about immigrants and Muslims in general, and how Muslims have been dehumanized, and how Muslim women have been portrayed as oppressed, waiting for white savior to come and save them, right? I am not oppressed, and I'm not waiting for any white savior to come save me. So I think
we thought you were, Saadia. Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah,
so glad to hear it.
Wait, what year did you start your show?
So I started it in October 2018. And I remember first, like, few episodes in, somebody said, "Oh, do you know there's another show similar to yours?" And it was your show. And I was like, I didn't even know that, because for me, it was pretty like spontaneous, visceral reaction to what was happening at the time. And I felt like I could not sit on the sidelines anymore. For me, it was all political because of my identity, right?
Because that would have been just when, like, I guess, tons of us went to the airport after the first Muslim ban. But then by the time you were making your show, it had almost normalized. Like, this Trump was in power. We were so exhausted. There's so many terrible things. And then, like, there was like the ban was making its way through the courts. So I love that you got galvanized at that point, because that's when you need it the most. Really, when things are starting to become acceptable, and like, it's not acceptable. It's never acceptable. So I think
it's never acceptable, right?
So that's amazing.
So in terms of podcasting, the way I see it, our team is building community around podcasting, right? A lot of people reach out to us, they write to us. For me personally, it's second gen kids of immigrants, not immigrants, because I think most of the times we have already accepted the fact that we are outsiders, insiders. We are not free insiders ever. But for second gen kids, I have two girls, and it's very difficult for them to navigate two worlds and their identities within that. But I want to ask all of you, how have you fostered that community? And how do you measure impact of the amazing, incredible work that all of you are doing? And we'll start with me.
Yeah, I can. I'm not sure about the impact. I find that such a nebulous world, and so, but I can definitely speak to the feeling of community that gets fostered with podcasts, which again is so strange because they're so personal and we listen to them straight into our ears. But I certainly talk all the time to friends who listen to certain podcasts, and we discuss conversations, and it grows into these other conversations. The way Amara was saying, like, she doesn't want to be like pontificating on a topic, but she does introduce it, and then everyone can like take it and run with it. But I suppose specifically with Mothers of Invention, what I got from, working on the podcast and also listening to the podcast was intergenerational kind of ties, and certainly kind of across culture ties as well. Because, it's a feminist podcast. We talk mainly to women who are, working on all these different fronts against climate chaos. And so there was, even our hosts, I mean, like Mary herself is, in her 70s, if she would admit that or not. And then Thimali brought in, there's all these young people fighting for climate justice now. Like, I sound like such a granny. There's all these young people. They're so wonderful, but there are so, we got to meet like these amazing teenagers. And so the cross generations, that was really special for me and really felt properly community based. And then definitely like because our topic is a global crisis, I definitely got to speak to and to hear from people that are all around the world experiencing all these different facets of this big, this big like global issue.
Thimali, what about you?
Yeah. Well, twofold, I suppose. If you're talking about impact, in terms of the numbers, or in terms of the demographics, I mean, obviously everybody knows how impossibly hard it is to measure. So we use social media to sort of give a gauge of like what our demographics are kind of looking like, and it has shifted a lot over the last 3 years. It also gets a bit murky because obviously, well, we're putting out a whole other, there's a whole other layer of editorial that goes on on social media. So it does skew a little browner, it does skew a little younger. But also the term impact means something slightly different for me and Maeve, right? Because Mothers of Invention is a impact podcast. That means I write both editorial strategy and social justice impact strategy. So I'm trying to figure out how we can take care of the women, mostly women we have on the show on the back end, and find ways to support them and give them all kinds of opportunities. And on the front end, again, trying to help the audience to get their butts off seats and go do something. So in terms of community for me and what I've seen over the last couple of years of working on the show, 3 years of working on the show, it's unbelievable. It's like honestly completely changed my life to be able to be in community with BIPOC women literally all over the world. Like I am, to research the show, I'm talking to people all over the planet who, and it's not just stories, these are their lives. This is what is happening to them right now. And so to be in the community also is involving global climate organizations who didn't involve any kind of intersectional feminism in their hiring practices, let alone their policy. And they're calling me going, do you know anybody that we could have for our, and I'm like, holy shit, this happens every week, every single week I get an email like that, every single week. So for me, that gives me an opportunity to give, these women, these incredible women, an opportunity to talk or to consult, like I'm consulting for those organizations,
and hopefully get paid.
I get paid virtually nothing, by the way, because there's still no money in climate. Unfortunately, that's a whole other story. But also, you do find that a lot of these folks still don't realize that you put brown people in the room not to tokenize them, but actually because they have ideas, and maybe whatever you come up with is going to be a half-baked solution, and maybe you should act. But anyway, that's a whole other story as well. But the community has now, as Maeve said, it includes youth, it includes Indigenous folks, includes Global South folks in the Arctic. I was at COP26 in November, and so to really feel the impact of Mothers of Invention in a UN global conference was absolutely mind-blowing. The opportunities that podcasting can actually afford if you are, as Amara's talking about as well, as Saadia is doing, is it really doubling down on people's curiosity and finding ways to build that community consciously. It's unbelievable what you can do.
And Amara, your thoughts on it?
I mean, for me, I think that measuring the impact of the stories that I tell, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm telling these stories is because I want people to listen, you know what I mean? So obviously the more people that are listening to these stories, the bigger the impact is, because they may not have heard, they hadn't, even if they live locally, I got a lot of feedback from people like, oh, I live right in this city, I've never heard this story, I didn't know this was missing, things like that. Getting the stories out there is part of, part of the impact for me is making sure that, that they're hearing it. And what's happened over the past, I mean, I started the podcast in March 2021. And almost immediately families started reaching out to me, families of missing women, families whose women in their families' murders are unsolved, asking me to cover their stories. And so what I saw was that there's not only a need for people to hear these stories, but there's a need for someone to tell these stories, because these families, the thing that they want the most is for someone to listen. And even when I started my show, and I'm like, I don't even have that many listeners right now. It didn't matter to them. You know what I mean? They just, somebody just listen to me, hear me out. I have, after I get finished with this, I have a woman who reached out to me in my inbox. Her stepdaughter went missing in January. They just found her body in March. They're not getting any help from the police. They're waiting for an autopsy. And it's just a nightmare. And she's just like, please help me. And sometimes I feel like the weight of the world's on my shoulder, because I'm like, how can I help? I'm really just a mom. I'm a podcaster. I'm just doing this with my husband from my house. But the fact that I'm willing to listen and then tell their story to however many thousands of people download that episode, somebody's going to listen, and somebody may know something. They may have a connection that I don't have. So for me, that's how I measure the impact. It's both of those things.
And you're all absolutely right, because impact, when we think about impact is how we impact individuals, how we impact societies, how we impact humanity. It's less about how many downloads, although that is always, as podcasters, unfortunately at the back of our minds, because everything is tied to that, which is extremely unfair. And that's why I want to circle back to funding. As an independent podcaster, I have struggled with funding. I'm privileged to be able to self-fund it to some extent, and then we started getting these sponsorships. But at the end of the day, independent podcasters of color, at least for me, through my experience, we find it extremely difficult to break through that noise, whether it's reaching out to networks because they have certain threshold, whether it's growing our outreach, reaching out to publications. How are you guys funding your podcast, and what difference, in your opinion, can funding make? And we'll start with Thimali.
It's a really important and good question. So Mothers of Invention is a project that was created by Doc Society, which is a non-profit based out of the UK. The privilege that Mothers of Invention has is that Doc Society has a history of foundation funding. So we were able to get scraps of funding to launch the show, but that also wasn't quite enough. I wasn't involved in season 1, Maeve was, but that had to include crowdfunding as well. So it's sort of little scraps of money from all over the place. Season 2 was sort of out of pocket for Dr. Society. They didn't actually have money to put it together, and it ended up being sort of back funded by an organization called the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. And then season 3, we gained a reputation by that point. People could see clearly what our impact was, editorially and in terms of our social justice impact. And we actually teamed up with a media company called Vulcan Productions, who actually created Summer of Soul, which you probably saw. So yeah, their executive production team was the same as ours. They really sadly folded in the middle of our season due to COVID. So we actually ended up getting scraps more funding than leftover pots of cash that they had. So that was kind of lucky. But Mothers of Invention has been off air for a year and a half, and that is explicitly because of lack of funding. There is there's only 3% of funds going to climate related issues across the board. That's not even climate media is this burgeoning field. And so that has been an enormous struggle for us as well. And we are pretty devoted to not taking any corporate ads, and that is an active decision that we make. That also comes out of a level of privilege because, again, of our access to foundation funding. I'm a big fat anti-capitalist, so it's great for me. Also, Mary's like, we also can't like muddy things for Mary as well. She can't really be associated with companies. So that's sort of the path that we've decided to take. So
yeah, and I do think I really appreciate you breaking it down that way, because it's so mystifying to me. Being a podcaster is just one job I do, and it is not the one I make my money from. And like the thing, you see these headlines, like podcast an $8 billion industry, and then
you're like, who are these people?
You know who they are? It's like the people who make like it's like Pod Save America or like Joe Rogan or I'm not putting them in the same bracket, but I'm saying all those men are making livings from this, and they are not doing free labor and emotional labor. In the case of Saadia, you discuss, talking with immigrants, and Amara talking with like murder victims' families, and like to think about all of this kind of unpaid labor that podcasters do is really frustrating, because we know that there's a market there. It's just like, how do you get into it? And I wish I had more advice on this. And I think, in my experience, I try not to do unpaid work for my own sake, but also because I don't want people to think, oh, like we'll just get her to do it for free. No, like it's important that we all insist on getting compensated for our labor, just for the people coming after us as well. And so I think that's one way that we can kind of, insist on our worth. And then, other ways are like, there's like ads, there's different companies. I think, Saadia, you mentioned, a lot of these networks, they want a threshold, like they want like, you have to have a guaranteed number, like 30,000 listeners. So, I mean, I think so many podcasts started off as labors of love, or, this passion where you were like, I have to make this, like nobody else is doing this, I have to make this. And I think though that give yourself some time frames and, get mentors if you can. I've definitely found the industry to be quite welcoming, and to be, if you come to somebody respectfully and say, can I just speak to you for 20 minutes about, and make your ask very specific, and try and figure out how to get paid, because this is really important. Yeah, you might be an anti-capitalist, but if you don't get paid, you'll burn out so fast and you won't be able to keep doing it.
It's
Absolutely.
true, especially in this field as well. It's like, it's climate, and I'm like, it's my family that's going to disappear into the ocean, not yours. So I end up having to do this work anyway. But it's true, it's not, it's sad. It's really sad. Yeah.
My always advice, like, especially like once I started doing the podcast, a lot of people come to me and ask me for advice. And the first thing I always say is, like, if you're going into podcasting to make money, then you're going into it for the wrong reason, because it's not a get rich. It's not that you can't make money, because you can, but it's not, you shouldn't be like, well, I'm going to make a podcast because I'm going to get rich right now. So I got way.
God bless those people that do.
And just like not getting paid, it's the easiest way to burn out, because as soon as you're not getting the immediate return on your investment, what's going to motivate you to get up the next week and do it again? You know, so I think for me, I've had a very unique experience. And I am very much aware of that, because I've only been doing my show for a year, well, a little bit over a year. And I started the show in March, and in July of 2021, a man named Sim Sarna, who runs a boutique podcasting network called Cloud 10, reached out to me and was very interested in adding my show to his network. And I ended up becoming a member of the network in August of 2021. And they have a partnership with iHeartRadio. And so I have been able to monetize my podcast through my network and the benefits of being on the network. They have about 30 shows on the network so far. And for me, it has been amazing, because at the end of the day, like I said, my number one goal is to get as many people to hear this show as possible. And I've been able to benefit that through having a network connection. The Sim he hosts a podcasting class at USC. This is what he does. And so I have been able to kind of benefit that, but I know that I have had that unique experience. There are a lot of podcasters who have been doing this a lot longer than me, who have not gotten the benefit of getting on a network or not been able to monetize their podcasts in that way. And so, my advice is that there are podcast networks out there. There are ways to monetize your podcast. I think that the goal, the number one thing is to create a great podcast, create good content, and worry about the other things later. Those things will come, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't start off seeking those things. They've kind of come to me, and I openly welcome them. Like, thank you, I appreciate this. Being a Black woman in this industry, getting to theirs, like, that's amazing, because I want to be able to open up other doors for other Black women podcasters and other women of color podcasters. So that would be my ultimate goal, is to have my own podcast network where then I can bring in women.
You know what I mean?
So, remember us, Amara.
Can we bring your network?
That's my ultimate goal. Like, I've created this little piece, and the network that I'm on, I've been very lucky, because they're very supportive. They're very amazing people. They have no creative control over my pod. They love the show. They love what I do. And they're really just helping me to get to that next level. He always tells me, he's like, I want to help you build your podcast empire. And I'm like, good, let's get it started. So at the ultimate goal is to, tell these stories, and not even just in the true crime space, like in the climate space, things that are affecting Black and brown women in marginalized communities. These are the things, the conversations, like you said, they don't want to put them on television. So we can create podcasts, and then we can say the things that need to be said, that are, being filtered out by mainstream media and mainstream content. So that's just my only advice, is like, create good content. My husband always says, create good stuff and the rest will come. He listens to this rapper, and he says, there is no algorithm. Like, there is no algorithm. Just create good stuff.
Are you talking about the Kendrick album right now? Because
no, it's a guy named his name is Lil Russell. His name is Lil Russell, and he's like an underground kind of independent rapper. My husband is in love with him. But he said that, he was like, there is no algorithm. Just keep putting out good content, and that's my advice for podcasters. Do what you're passionate about. Put your all into it. If you know what I mean? I can't say put as much into it as you have for that podcast. You might not be able to put your all into it. You might have other things, but put your passion into it, and everything else will come. If it's not ads, it can be opportunities to speak. It can be other opportunities to do things in that space. That podcasting may open up that door for you. So just keep doing it.
And to recap, there are so many things that we can talk about, but as I said in the beginning, most of us here are privileged in one way or the other. So remember that it's important to have great content, which we all are striving to achieve. We have passion, but at the end of the day, it's important, if there are funders and networks listening to this, watching this, to maybe reset your guidelines and focus more on content, focus more on diversity, focus more on expression of thought rather than download numbers, because it's a vicious cycle. Sometimes people can't get those download numbers because they don't have the outreach to get those download numbers. It's not the content always. So please remember, And I'm so glad that we had this amazing chat. We could do this for another 5 hours, and I can't wait to meet everybody here in New York. I didn't know. I'm like so excited. But what I do on my podcast, like my last question is always define America in a word or a sentence. And believe it or not, most guests are like, what? America? How do we define it? But I'm going to tweak it a bit here and ask each one of you in the end to define your podcasting journey thus far in a sentence, a word, maybe a phrase. How has it been for you? And we'll start with Maeve.
Okay, so my podcasting life has been, I would say, up and down, always exciting, and definitely unexpected.
I love it. I love it. Thimali?
I don't know if I misunderstood the assignment, but I wanted to say, sort of with my producer's hat on, my general approach is to never forget that people only want to save what they can relate to.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And Amara, for you?
I would say that my podcast journey has been overwhelming, but rewarding. And my only word of advice is consistency. Stay consistent in what you're doing.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. And it's also important, us podcasters, to come together and lift each other up and build coalitions, because that matters too. So thank you so much. This was wonderful.